Our first keynote speaker this morning is Mr. Benjamin Brooks. Mr. Brooks was one of the first African Americans to enlist in the Pennsylvania State Police, where he rose to the rank of major. He is a graduate of Kutztown University, the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania's Senior Management Training Program, the FBI National Academy, Penn State University Police Supervisor and Executive Development Program, and the United States Department of Justice Diversity Training. He has over 30 years of experience in diversity, inclusion, and the impact of unconscious bias on leadership blind spots. Mr. Brooks' specific area of expertise include diversity, inclusion, and the impact of unconscious bias on leadership in the workplace, how to deal with difficult people, and policing your image. As an active member of the National Speakers Association, Mr. Brooks has spoken to an incredible cross-section of audiences on a variety of topics. His primary expertise is in preventing sexual harassment, as well as understanding, valuing, and managing diversity. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Benjamin Brooks.
Good morning. May 20th, 2020. America witnessed one of the most horrific examples of a blind spot decision as Officer Derek Chauvin placed his knee on the neck of George Floyd and held it there for 9.5 minutes. As he was pleading for his life, I can't breathe, mother, I cannot breathe. We all had a first row seat as we watched the life oozing from this man's body. The question is, where were you? What were you doing? What was the feeling that you had when you saw that? It's very important, ladies and gentlemen, to talk about this in terms of leadership to blind spots and how those blind spots, those decisions impact on our lives or livelihood. Today, we're going to spend a few moments with you going over this whole notion of leadership blind spots. And one of the biggest blind spots we talk about now is bias in the workplace. First slide, please. And what we're going to look at then is to talk about define blind spots. What are they and how does it impact you? And talk about foundational principles. We know that you can build the most fantastic cathedral. If you don't have a good foundation, it's not going to materialize. And talk about the origin of blind spots and also unconscious bias and how that affects the decisions that we make. And then I'll talk about what can we do then to be able to address those situations. Next slide. I believe that everything we do in life begins with a good solid foundation. We know that, and those foundational principles, we should guide everything that we're going to do as we talk about diversity and inclusion. And for this day, I'm pleased that you're having this day as your first one, because it's important to celebrate what you have accomplished so far, but also take a look at what's going to happen in the future. And that whole things begin with a thing we called attitude. Zig Ziglar said it is your attitude, not your aptitudes, which will determine your altitude, which means then it doesn't matter how smart you think you are. Without a positive attitude, it's not going to happen for you. It impacts everything that you do. It's how you see the world. When you wake up in the morning, you choose the attitude that you want for the day. And the attitude that you choose impacts every interaction you will have with every human being with whom you come in contact during the course of a day. Very, very important. Again, it says it's how you see the world. I remember I was doing a session in Harrisburg on a class of dealing with difficult people, and I walked in, and it's very high energy. Good morning, how's everybody and everything? And so there was an old lady sitting down front, and I said, good morning, ma'am, how are you? And she said, I'm okay. I said, you know what class this is? She said, yeah, dealing with difficult people. I said, I guess you're ready, aren't you? Interestingly enough, she was a supervisor. How would you have like to deal with that individual who's coming to you like that? And so the idea here is that you must have a positive attitude if you're going to deal with people, particularly in a multicultural workplace. And we say, and your attitude, in talking about dealing with people, Carnegie Institute did a study some years ago, and they discovered that 15% of the success that you enjoy in your business in a multicultural workplace involve your technical skills or your mental ability. 85% with how well you deal with and manage people. Think about that. And so you ask yourself then, if that's important, how much time do you think organizations spend ensuring that that 15% is in place? And the prevailing wisdom is about 80%. If you spend 80% of your time on what gives you 15% success, isn't that kind of problematic? So the question we ask you then is, what is it that keeps you awake at night? Is it the cars, the computers, infrastructure? And you say, no, it's people. And how much time do you have left to deal with them? So that becomes very, very important. So your attitudes are contagious, and ask yourself, is yours worth catching? And then we talk about reaction versus response. This gets at the heart of all that we're going to be talking about, because in this business, we react when we don't know what to do. We respond, however, when we have full knowledge. For example, you cannot swim. You're sitting by the pool and your 2-year-old child falls into the pool. What are you likely to do? Shout it out. What would you like to do? You jump in, what's going to happen? You both are going to drown. But if you understand CPR, first aid, how to swim, no big deal. Every time you react, you get in trouble. Go back in your life, particularly where something has gone wrong, you will find it more than likely it occurred because you reacted as opposed to responding. We want to get you into the response mode, because that's where we need to be as we talk about D&I. When you walked into this session today, every one of you came in here with a toolbox. Not actually, but perceptually. And in that box are all of the tools that you've needed to do your jobs as effectively or as efficiently as you have been able to do it to date. What we want to do then is to add to that toolbox. Abraham Maslow once said, if the only tool you have is a hammer, then everything will look like a nail. Hello? And if you look at America today, America is in a serious reactive mode. And the idea here is in the reactive mode because they don't have the information because of blind spot decisions. And then we talk about empathy. We hear that word bandied about. What does it mean? What does it mean, sir? What does empathy mean to you, sir? Feeling what the other person's feeling. Going over to the other side of the table to see what it looks like from that person's perspective. It is the most powerful word in the English language. If you don't have empathy, you will never, ever be able to make an emotional connection with anybody you're trying to impact or influence. And we say that in empathy, you have to walk a mile in my shoes to understand what corns and bunions feel like. Coupled with empathy is the word compassion. Empathy without compassion rings hollow. What are we talking about? Empathy is understanding that, but the compassion is being able to take it to the next level, and that's very important. Economics. The economics of bias, for example, when I saw one estimated, the organization spent about $64 million a year on decisions involving bias. That's very problematic. And then we talk about safety. And most of us on the base, for example, when we talk about safety, we talk about checking folks in at the gate, making sure their doors are locked, making windows are closed, and the whole bit. But we want to talk about here about psychological safety. And that, to me, is the psychological safety, for me, is the kind of safety when you can say to the commandant or the leader of the base, let me tell you how that policy that you did impacts me. Why is that so important? In this business, ladies and gentlemen, there's two perspectives that every individual has a need to be heard and have their needs met. And what happens is when I tell you how that policy so impacts me, I want to make sure that you're able to hear me. Because if you're not able to hear me, you're in a defensive posture, and when the hearing shuts down, nothing happens. So it's very important to be able to hear, folks, and so that's what this psychological safety is really all about. Next slide, please. So what are blind spots? We say it's an unrecognized weakness or threat that has the potential to undermine a leader's success. I say that it is the difference between information that you have and information that you really need. And so the idea here then is that we all are going through a many serious blind spots. Next slide, please. And I try to look at this, and I believe that, for me, it's important to be able to pictorially describe everything we talk about. And so you see, I have the mirror of a car. And I got that mirror because I took a class on AARP on safe driving. So you actually said, well, wait a minute, 35 years of the state police, and you're taking a driving course? Yeah, because I wanted to talk about this. So the first class we had, and the instructor said, look, what I want to share with you then, he said, one of the biggest issues that older drivers have is that they are subject to blind spots because of the mirrors. And I said, why? Because if you think about it, and each of you, as we go along today to talk about this, I want you to think about it from a personal perspective, because every one of you, you drive. So he says that when you are looking at the mirror, basically what you see is the side of your vehicle. And we say that you see what you want to see. How does that translate into your business? When you have people next to you, you have individuals who will tell you what you want to hear as opposed to what you really need to know. And that's very, very problematic. And so the idea here is that when you have folks who can tell you what you need to hear, you know, that's very important to you. You need people to tell you when you have lettuce in your teeth. Because if they don't tell you, you will find yourself making bad decisions. So what I did then, he says, when you are able to see the side of your vehicle, make a slight adjustment so you no longer see the side of the vehicle, then you will have a clear view of those lanes. So I was driving for Uber for a while, and I tried that. And it works. And I found myself in the middle of New York City driving, and I was able to do it without having to turn like I normally do. Next slide, please. And so as a result of that, I had a much clearer vision. In your business, then, when you have people who will share the information with you, it's going to give you a clearer picture. Your EEO people here who are going to guide the organization are going to tell you a lot of things that you really don't always want to hear. But they're going to tell you things that you really need to know. And the more information you have, the clearer it's going to be, and the more coherent decisions that you're going to be able to make as a result of what they have shared with you. Next slide, please. Now, we talk a lot about diversity and inclusion. What does that mean? Well, you know, diversity, we embrace diversity. Yeah, we have some white folks, we have some black folks, we have some males, we have some females, and that's fine. And they're all feel included. Do they really? It's interesting that you have representational perspective there, but is that part of what they're really, really all about? And so I look at this, and as we talk about diversity, and we talk about primary and secondary dimension of diversity, and we say primary dimension of diversity, we talk about, and I put the iceberg because I think the iceberg begins to illustrate basically what we're trying to get across here. Because 10% of the iceberg gets above the surface of the water. And so that the primary dimension, we talk about age, race, physical, sexual orientation, gender, ethnicity, and all of those. And that's what we tend to look at. We know that when we meet people, we have 8 to 10 seconds to decide whether or not we like somebody, you know, and so that we've been to judge on that. Now, what is interesting about that, as I stand here on the stage this morning and I look at the audience, and I would say to you, I used to say to my classes, what can you definitively say about me as I stand here? And they will go through a lot of iteration. Well, you're tall, you're black, you're bald, and all this, you're married and whatever. And I said, okay, that's fine. And I was sharing that one day we had a guy doing that exercise. And, you know, someone, you know, he didn't have a ring on it, but somebody said, well, you're not married. And he said later on, he said, I am really married, you know. And they looked at him and said, you know, so he had a ring on his right hand instead of the left. And so the people said, well, wait a minute. You say you were married, you know. You can't be married because you got the ring on the wrong hand. He said, because I married the wrong woman. So the idea here then is that we make maximum decisions on the scantest bit of information. We talk about that. We say this in the 10% here is when the biases, prejudice, stereotypes, and assumptions are made. But what we really are looking for is to down below and below the surface, because that's where the facts and the treasure really is. And the more we know about diversity, the more we know about inclusion, we know about our personnel, the easier it's going to be for us to make those cogent decisions. That's going to be very important. Next slide, please. Now, let's take a good look at that bias then. It is the one thing that drives people bonkers. Because some women say, oh, you were a biased person. Oh, my Lord. And people say, well, I am the least biased person in the world, and then you're dead. Bias is how we have been able to live to date. It's not good or bad. It just is. But where does this whole thing start? We know psychologists tell us between the ages of 0 and 6 is when a child is born. The majority of learning takes place during that time because of imitation or emulation. And after that, it's a reinforcement of those learned behaviors. All right, now, think about that. Each of you, as we talk about tracing where you are right now, you are a sum total of your total life's experiences. And as a child, when you were born, you were bias-free. Every experience that you had as a child created a bias, preface for or against something or someone. And every bias then created a story. For example, the first time you touched a hot stove, it burned. And we say that when you have an experience, it takes 50 thousandths of a second to be registered in your brain, and it fed right back to you, and it causes a reaction. And so once that happened, it is in your brain, it is there. Now, if it's not examined for a long time, it will remain dormant. But if it's being reinforced, if you study touching things, it's going to remind you. And that because it guides the decisions that we make, okay? And so the idea then, we talk about the unconscious bias. It becomes unconscious bias because something has not been examined for a long period, and we'll go talk about that, But I looked at this bias and how it impacts us. And I think there's two perspectives of that guides our decision making. We talk about bias of fear, trepidation, or dehumanization. Or there's bias of comfort, acceptance, or humanization. And I'm going to give you some dramatic examples, and I share those examples with you because I think it's important to look at the severity of the decisions that are being made as a result of these examples, and look at this and think about, well, how does that relate to where I am, and what do I need to do to make a better decision? And we call it OPE. We talk about other people's experiences, because as a police officer, looking at situations, I look at situations across the country, and I see things happening, and I look at what it is that I do not want to do for myself, all right? Now, let's take the first one, for example. Walter Scott, a young African-American male in Charleston, South Carolina, was stopped for a minor traffic violation by a white police officer. And when he stopped, the officer asked him for his cards, and for whatever reason, Walter Scott just ran. And the officer got out, and he fired a number of shots and brought Walter Scott down. The officer subsequently said, I had a fear for my life. Bias of fear, trepidation, the dehumanization, because Walter Scott was gunned down like a wounded animal. Contrast that then with Dylan Roof, a young white male who went into an African-American church in South Carolina, and he walked in, they welcomed him in with open arms, and he worshiped with them for over an hour. And he shot and killed 9 people. He was subsequently arrested without incident, taken to a Burger King for a meal. Bias of comfort, acceptance, humanization. Let's try another one that's less dramatic, if you will. My wife is a professor at one of the universities, and she said to me one day, she said, a young white female came to me, and she said she was in tears, and she said, Dr. Collins, can I talk to you? And she said, yeah. She said, Dr. Collins, I'm troubled. So what's the matter? She said, my grandmother was on the transplant list, kidney transplant list. And one day, The doctor came into it and said, Mrs. So-and-so and so, I have great news for you. And she said, what's that, doc? She said, we found a perfect match. And she looked up and said, Doc, is it from somebody black? He said, yes. She said, I'd rather die. Think about that. Bias of fear, trepidation, dehumanization. But contrast that with our late Governor Robert Casey, who had an autoimmune disease and he needed a triple transplant. And one day, a young black male was killed in a homicide. And Governor Casey was on the list, and he accepted those organs. Bias of comfort, acceptance, humanization. What are we saying? In this business, ladies and gentlemen, the more you can humanize people, the more accepting they're going to be. Deal with the humanity. Very important. Next slide, please. Words are powerful because words create pictures. Okay, next. Pictures create emotions. Next. Emotions create action, and action creates behavior. In our area right now, we have a place called Sesame Place. And how many of you are familiar with Sesame Street? Okay. Sesame Street has a kind of a personal thing for me because my late father-in-law, T. Collins, was one of the first animators of Sesame Street. And he developed the character Wanda the Witch. But see, Sesame Place is kind of like a theme park, and they had folks there, and there was an incident a couple of weeks ago where the character there, now we think of a Sesame Street is a young people's program, and Sesame Place, they had characters there, and those characters there snubbed the young African-American children, and now there is a big brouhaha there right now. Think about that. Now, when people hear the word Sesame Street, what are they thinking about now? Do they think about education with their young kids, or do they think about the theme park stuff up there? And so we think about how powerful those words are. It's almost like in our business, when we talk about Black Lives Matter, folks get freak out because Black Lives Matter. They'll say, well, you know, oh, well, Blue Lives Matter. But what people don't understand, Black Lives Matter is about humanity, and Blue Lives Matter is about a job. Very, very important. Next slide, please. Then how do we deal with these issues? First of all, recognize that you have bias. And when I ask the question, people say, well, how many people in this room are biased? And some folks raise their hand. And I said, everybody is biased. The idea here is to say, if this is how you've been able to live, that's very important. Do I have biases? You betcha. I remember I took my car into a dealer because I had a loud noise. And I drove in, and there's a young lady sitting at the desk, and she said, can I help you? And I said, yeah, I'm having an issue with my car. And so she was saying, well, there's a guy sitting behind her. So I'm talking to her, but I'm looking at him. And she said to him, would you take him out and see what's happening? So we went out, took a ride around. And as he was riding around, I asked him, I said, how long have you been working here? So he said, about 3 weeks. I started laughing. He said, what's the matter? He said, I talk about diversity and bias, but yet I exhibited it when I walked in here. And I talk about that and said, wow, do we need to recognize that? We got to recognize, we own that bias. So if I ask you, so when you leave here today, if someone ever asks you, are you a biased person? Yes, I am. Because what happens in this business, ladies and gentlemen, we spend so much time trying to defend an indefensible position. And the idea is, if someone said that you were biased, just ask the question, what is it that makes me biased? And let them start talking and be able to tell you, okay? Listen, and ask for feedback. It has been said that no one ever listened themselves out of a job. I remember with the Pennsylvania State Police, and talk about bias in it, I was involved in one of the biggest discrimination suits in the history of the state police. And it occurred because the leadership completely ignored the information we were trying to give them. See, because we were telling them what they needed to hear, but they wanted to hear what they wanted to hear. And as a result of them not listening to, between 1974 and 1991, they spent a total of $33 million trying to defend an indefensible position. Isn't that very interesting? Listen to your people. Listen to your people, okay? Make sure you understand the feedback. If we tell you that, the Diversity Day is very important because a Diversity Day is for us to look at how we value our employees, how we can learn to do some things differently, that's going to be very, very important. And then we talk about create an atmosphere where people are able to level with you. When I talked about earlier about this whole notion of psychological safety, we don't know how unsafe many of our people feel in organizations. If we were to have a conversation, candid conversation with them, they will probably tell you a whole lot that you really don't know. And it's very important to make that happen. Because you can't talk about diversity and inclusion unless people are at the table and they're able to participate. Develop the capacity to use a flashlight on yourself. Take a look at the end of the day. What did I do that may have offended somebody? What did I do that was a blind spot decision for me? What more can I do with this whole business? And then explore awkwardness and discomfort. It is not going to be easy, ladies and gentlemen, to admit that you have some kind of flaws. It's not who we really are. We do marriage coaching and counseling, and I say that, my wife points out a lot of blind spots for me, and I'm sure that you have the same thing out there. And so as we look at this, as we celebrate this Diversity Day, is to take a look at everything we talked about. I want you to look at this session today as a turkey dinner. Take the meat, throw the bones away. Everything you need to know about diversity and inclusion, we talk about some things, and you'll hear the next speaker talk about it as well. Look at that information and use that information because it's this thing that's going to allow you to make the best decision that you possibly can make. And so I'll leave you with this. It's a poem called The Cold Within. 6 humans trapped by happenstance and black and bitter cold. Each one possessed a stick of wood, or so that story is told. Their dying fire in need of logs, the first woman held hers back. For the faces around the fire, she noticed one of them was black. The second man, looking across the way, saw one not of his church and couldn't bring himself to give the first his stick of birch. The third one sat in tattered clothes. He gave his coat a hitch. Why should his log be put to use to warm the idle rich? The rich man just sat back and thought of the wealth he had in store and how to keep what he had earned from the lazy, shiftless poor. The black man's face bespoke revenge as the fire passed from his sight, for all he saw in his stick of wood was a chance to spite the white. The last man of this forlorn group did not accept the gain. Giving only to those who gave was how he played the game. The logs held tight in death's still hands was proof of human sin. Oh, they didn't die from the cold without. They died from the cold within. And as my good friend, the late Bob Murphy from Nacogdoches, Texas, used to say to his wife as she's going to the beauty shop, good luck to you.
Thank you, Mr. Brooks.